Then we can go. And before we go on, I would like to also inform everyone that this session is being recorded, and basically the session is being recorded. So my name is Ibiyode, Ibikunle. I'm an associate at ENR Advisory. I did my master's at Queen Mary 2019-2020 during the pandemic. Very stressful. Yeah. I did energy and natural resources law. So I think we just go around the table just to, so that's Jennifer.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Martins-Okundia, and I was at Queen Mary for my master's in 2010, 2011, and my master's was in banking and finance law.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. My name is Nosa. I'm a partner at ENR Advisory. Happy to be hosting this event on behalf of the Alumni Association. I was at Queen Mary in 2015, and I did the MSc in Law and Finance.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adipsi Sonda. I was at Queen Mary in 2013-2014. I did LLM Law and Economics.
Good evening, everyone. Dipo Akinbode. I'm the Deputy General Counsel for Aradel Holdings. I'm not an alumni of Queen Mary, fortunately, but I was invited to come and speak with you guys.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adebayo Ajayi. I'm the Legal and Regulatory Manager for Airtel Networks Limited. I did my master's at Queen Mary 2013 to 2014 in Comparison and International Dispute Resolution. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Osazuwa Osho. I was at Queen Mary 2013-2014. I did my master's corporate commercial law. I'm a legal consultant with UK Africa.
Well, my name is Michelle Matterson. More practice law here in Lagos. I was at Queen Mary in 1983.
Yeah, thank you. So just to jump into what we're here today to talk about, please.
Sorry, apologies. Sorry. Okay, my name is Amala, partner at Strand Bank Partners. 2018.
So we are here today to talk about the sustainability and energy transition, exploring legal and financing options. It's no news that issues around sustainability and energy transition has become very important. Just recently, we had we got the news of a country that had gone 6 days fully on renewable energy, and that was Portugal. They have done 6 days fully on renewable energy without any fossil fuel. So there are already a lot of indications that energy transition is at full steam, and of course, there are a lot of positives about it. But here in Nigeria, we generally not at the level where we should be, and some of the issues we have generally are surrounding issues relating to the policy aspect of it and also the financing. The financing actually tends to be the most important issue, and we have the panelists with us. Nosa is a partner at ENR Advisory, Jennifer, General Counsel at Rand Merchant Bank, and Dipo as well, who will be answering some of the questions that we have, and just to give us more insights and more ideas into how to navigate the legal and financing options available to us. Now, just to make things a bit easier, I've kind of curated today's theme around the energy transition. And just a bit about the energy transition, it's the need to, basically, it's just about the fact that we need to move away from fossil fuels. Our dependence on fossil fuels has to be reduced because of the effects on the environment. And the easiest way to do that, of course, would be to find alternative sources of energy, most especially renewables. And that would probably guide our discussion today. So the first question I'll be throwing will be to Jennifer. And because we're looking at one start with the financing aspect, which is more important. So my question to you is on fossil fuel, exactly. In Nigeria, we, being a producer of fossil fuels, we rely heavily on it, both for consumption and for income purposes. So as a financial institution, especially an international finance institution, you are, from your shareholders and from your board, you have ESG targets that you need to meet in terms of financing projects, energy projects, or mostly projects in Nigeria. So we just want to know how this applies in Nigeria in terms of international standards and how you're able to navigate it, especially in a country like Nigeria that's heavily dependent on fossil fuels.
Okay, so thanks again. I think that, from my own perspective, I think just the realization of the fact that financial institutions, like you say, play a very important role in driving compliance on ESG. I think that it's going to introduce some sort of disruption in the way that financial institutions are currently thinking about financing transactions generally on a global scale. So I think it's important for us to also sort of state that.
Just give us a minute.
Okay, so I was just saying that the role of banks or financial institutions generally in terms of what they do, providing finance to organizations that do projects, financing transactions, they have a pivotal role. So they have an important role in just driving the conversations around ESG compliance. And for that reason, there's going to be some sort of disruption in terms of how financial institutions are thinking about providing finance globally, on a global note. So, I think it's important for us to sustain the environment, and that is clear. It's also important for us to start to look at the impact of financing on society, on the environment generally. And so again, there's just going to be a new concept, a new way of banks thinking about providing finance. Just to throw some color on the conversation, I had a look at the World Health Organization's website, and I saw that from their research, climate change is directly contributing to humanitarian emergencies. So from heat waves, wildfires, floods, and the like, and it's being stated that these are increasing in scale, in frequency, and in intensity. And then it also states that about 3.6 billion people today are already living in areas that are susceptible to climate change. Again, it was estimated that between 2030 and 2050, there will be about 250,000 deaths per year. And this is going to be caused by the effects of climate change. So again, it just shows us that it's serious. It's serious business that we're talking about today. And the issue is such that it's not limited to a particular area. So it's not limited to just the developed or underdeveloped areas. It's everyone, and Nigeria is part of, the countries that are going to be hit. So we will find that recently it's difficult for you to state the differences between the seasons in Nigeria. So just a few days ago, I think we saw heavy rainfall in November. So clearly, we are already being hit by climate change. Just to take that further as well, we see, like the Ogoni crisis, where you have impacts of projects on communities and how that just trickles down to even children, adults dying and the like. So it's important that financial institutions, because of the role that they play in financing these transactions, start to look at ESG very typically. And it's not restricted to bank lending, so it could also be capital markets. So just assisting entities to finance transactions by assessing the capital market, whether it's through green bonds, social bonds, or the like. So it's important for us to start to drive the narrative as financial institutions. I wanted to also point out, just in response to your question directly, some of the reasons or some of the things that drive financial institutions in terms of the consideration of ESG principles. So we see that in recent times, there's been increasing need to look at this area because external funders, for instance, the development banks, they're now paying more attention to these things, and they're asking banks increasingly to show their ESG story. What are you doing in terms of ESG? How are you ensuring that your borrowers of the funds we provide to you are complying with ESG? So again, this is impacting on the banks directly and the way that they also can make money. So there's time to look at this very critically. And in just doing that, what banks are then looking at now is their credit processes. How can you sort of incorporate ESG principles or just adaptations of the ESG principles in your consideration of how you give credits to borrowers? There's also the KYC processes. So again, banks are looking at credit processes, KYC processes. How do you incorporate ESG principles in those sort of considerations? The second point I also wanted to make was in relation to the sustainability standards 1 and 2 by the ISSB. That's the International Sustainability Standards Board. So essentially, the FRCN has adopted the sustainability standards 1 and 2, and essentially entities will start to report on these standards. I think it's 2024, and so clearly we would, as financial institutions, you have to start to look at that because you have to start to have a narrative. So your ESG story, how is it that ESG is impacting on your ability to get cash flow? So all of those would be reported, and to that extent, financial institutions have to start to consider that very typically. We also have the Climate Change Act that was passed in 2021. What that says in effect is that any entity that has at least 50 people would have to start to report on the way that they're complying with just reducing the carbon footprint, carbon emissions in line with the targets that the federal government has set. So I think all of this is the reason why you have financial institutions start to look more deeply, more thoroughly into ESG. And I think I'll stop there so that we can move the conversation forward.
So thank you very much for that, Jennifer. Two things I picked from the discussions were the ESG stories and the sustainability standards. So I imagine that for every transaction you work on, these are prominent things that you consider all the time. And that leads me to Dipo. I mean, being a project owner and project sponsor, being on the other side or the receiving side, I imagine that being, most of your projects are capital intensive and you lean heavily on financing to get to actualize some of your goals. And I'm sure that some of these issues come up all the time, especially with ESG and sustainability standards. So my question basically is, from your perspective as a project sponsor, how has ESG in general, how has it assisted or hindered you in your business activity, and how have you successfully navigated some of these requirements?
Thank you. I mean, you're absolutely right, and Jennifer has touched on a lot of points that impact, I think, all businesses in Nigeria. Being in the oil and gas industry specifically, there's a lot of attention on the impact that oil and gas companies have on the environment around them, and that impact is looked through the lens of the national importance of making sure that crude is flowing and that gas is flowing to where it needs to go, because the country depends on that income. I think everybody's well aware of the focus that regulators have put on the oil and gas industry from an ESG perspective. And so as a result of that, ESG is not necessarily new to oil and gas companies. The truth is that in many forms, we've been evolving to ensure that we comply with ESG in our business practices. As a matter of fact, even the PIA, intentionally or otherwise, has a lot of strong points on ESG that are now things that have the regulatory force behind them. A simple example is gas flaring. It's become extremely uneconomical to flare gas, which means that if you're developing an upstream project if you want to acquire an upstream asset, you need to consider gas utilization as part and parcel of your capex from day one. And that's because if you flare gas, it has the risk of making your entire project uneconomical. And lenders are wise to all of these issues. As a matter of fact, we recently closed refinancing where with the development bank, where the CPs, the conditions precedents to closing that loan, had significantly more ESG focused requirements than you would typically find in financing. Typically, banks are focused on bankability, commercial viability, but now we're seeing banks reviewing projects from a technical standpoint to make sure that you are using the right equipment, the right technology, emission saving technology, that you are putting in ESG policies in place in your projects, that you have the right people on ground to enforce those principles. And that has made, in fairness, made the compliance process to get to financial close a bit more difficult. But I would say that it has overall benefits for us as a company and as an industry as a whole. This is because there are long-term benefits for ESG compliance. Simple examples are the fact that an ESG compliant company is most likely to reduce its risk of regulatory fines. It's most likely to ensure that its stakeholders, its host community is in sync with it. It doesn't have all those disruptions. And again, that's another way that the PIA entrenches ESG into its framework with the host community trust fund requirements. The industry was largely for a long time run by the IOCs. As the IOCs exited, you've seen a lot of the transactions that they exited that they passed on decommissioning and abandonment risks. They passed on environmental liability risks to new companies who may not necessarily have the funding or the capital base to deal with those risks. And because of that, the PIA has made it such that decommission and abandonment provisions are more entrenched so that those funds are available when it is time to restore the environment to where it is. And another thing to add is that I think not complying with ESG runs the risk of excluding you from a lot of capital markets. A lot of international development agencies will not lend to you unless you prioritize ESG in your operations. There are a lot of green funds that you excluded from accessing if you don't incorporate ESG into your operations. And those green funds, for example, only have limited scope in terms of who they can lend to. And so it's to the long-term advantage of any business in Nigeria, especially those in extractive industries that already are seen to be large contributors to carbon emissions, to ensure that ESG is prioritized. And I think that the research has shown that prioritizing ESG for most companies has a long-term benefit and will improve your bottom line from a financial standpoint in the long term. So for us, I think it's not been difficult because as an oil and gas company, this is a process that didn't just start with the Climate Change Act. This has been a long process, but we are already seeing the benefits. Also, as you had mentioned, now it's a requirement for you to report your sustainability efforts as part of your IFRS reporting obligations. You don't want to be seen as greenwashing because that has an impact of affecting your share price. Your stakeholders are watching it. So I think overall, it's been very beneficial to us. It has a cost, but I think the cost pays off itself in the long run.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So from what you just said, understanding is that in the long run, it's a positive for everyone because, especially I liked the part about the host communities. I know that we've had issues with a lot of environmental problems, especially in host communities. And if more companies, especially the local oil companies, get into the business, if they take their ESG very carefully and very seriously, most of the problems we've had in the past with host communities will most likely be very reduced. Thank you for that. And I can imagine that in the discussions in the points we heard from Jennifer and Dipo, one of the key aspects of it is still tied to the regulation. You know, from the policy standpoint, you know, basically when the finance aspects, the project aspects, what actually drives it home is a coherent body of policies that shows the direction that the country, the government is taking towards this. So then that brings me to you, Nosa. In Nigeria right now, we don't have one specific regulation that guides ESG. Our ESG policies or regulations of ESGs are scattered in several laws or in different policies. So my question to you is that, do you think that based on how we need to catch up with the world, or especially developed economies, do you think that there's a need for a comprehensive legislation just to show the world how serious we are? Or do you think that we should just allow this policies just grow at their own pace, or there's a need for like a coherent, a comprehensive policy?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessary to have that one comprehensive legislation for the world knows that we are complying with ESG concerns. I think, and I'll use a simple example. Before the enactment of the one comprehensive legislation guiding competition regulation in Nigeria, we had different sector-specific regulations. We had the CBN Act that regulated competition issues M&A in banking sector. We had the SEC that had some regulations around that. We had whether it's in the pharmaceutical industry, different sector-specific regulations. Now, that's being hamper activity or hinder activities from going on, M&A activity from going on, or not only just M&A activities, competition from happening, or or addressing the public's concerns when it came to competition and legal issues. Now, in the same vein, even without a comprehensive legislation that regulates ESG in Nigeria, we have different sector-specific acts in our laws that places ESG at the forefront. We have the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, we have the Code of Corporate Governance, we have the CBN issued sustainability principles, we have that issued by the FRCN, the Financial Regulatory Authority. So we have all of these regulations, and I think the parties in the industry or whatever industry they play understand, those particular regulations or body of laws, that they need to comply with. In the oil and gas industry, where we do a lot of work, the PIA, as Dipo said, has put at the forefront several ESG principles, whether it's from the section of your Host Community Development Fund, which is basically codifying a principle that had previously existed, but maybe not in black and white, right? And also an environmental reputation fund for you to set aside funds, to repair the environment after your activities. You have, even in terms of the governance framework in the industry, you have a regulators that now, actually determine or support operators in the industry in terms of, their governance and also sustainable operations. So this was different from the regulator that had existed before the GPR, before the PIA, that was basically just a regulator but not have economic and those kind of sustainability principles attached to its functions and powers. So we have all of these body of work, and I think it's the government has gone a step further, right, by having the Climate Change Act, which sort of centers on Nigeria's obligations towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and working towards net zero by 2060. Now, with all of that said, it could be helpful, right, having one comprehensive database or one comprehensive document that sort of, dovetails into obligations at wide, or at large, that could serve as a one-stop, shop and reference point for everyone to look at and know exactly what the obligations would be. And it again will be similar to what we have with the FCCPA, that the Competition Protection Act, which sort of creates one regulator and one body of laws and regulations that cuts across all industries. So it will be helpful, but I don't think in terms of sort of determining or for people looking from outside, looking inward, and as to whether we are serious about addressing ESG concerns. I don't think that would be the reason why you feel otherwise. I think we've shown enough commitment, both from a governmental standpoint and also from the economic activities that are done by private players, that ESG concerns are real. They are being addressed, by all the players from a governmental standpoint, through the passage of laws, of codifying policies that are hitherto existed, and even from private players, setting up ESG departments, putting ESG concerns in their reporting framework, and even in terms of from a funding perspective, we closed the financing recently, where a significant CP was the fact that they had to have a gas utilization project. They couldn't flare gas. If not, then that was not going to release funds. They were not to get the drawdown. So those the industry already takes those concerns into consideration, even without one comprehensive body of work.
Thank you very much for that. So just like Nosa said, just a simple recap. While it looks like we need one body of laws to direct our ESG policies, the several industries that have, they're getting it right, and they have those policies and those laws that take us to that are actually good. And so, speaking of emissions and all of that, I just want to, take us back to 1992 during the Kyoto Protocol, the United Nations convention, the framework on climate change. And one of the key things to come out of that conference, or that protocol, was the use of carbon offsets, how to get some sort of positives from carbon offsets. But before we go to that, I'm just going to come back to you, Jennifer. In all of this, one of the most ambitious ways which these things have been achieved is through green financing. We have had green bonds and the likes. And I just want to, in your position, I just want you to just shed more light on how well these green financing methods have worked in Nigeria, especially green bonds. I know that we've issued a few, there have been a few issued in Nigeria like that. And I just want you to just tell us how well these green financing options work, and if they'll become mainstream soon.
So I mean, I'm not sure if they'll be mainstream in the way that you put it, but I know that there's been a couple of green bonds issued in Nigeria. I was part of the team that worked on the Access Bank green bonds. And so I sort of know the process, for issuing green bonds at the time when I was in practice. But, I think that just like had been adduced earlier, there's some funds that are specific to only people that adhere to ESG. So if you want to assess those funds, your projects have to be green, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you have incorporated ESG principles in whatever process that you're putting in place, or in your projects, essentially. So yes, there's been the ESG considerations, that the green bonds that have been issued in Nigeria. There are regulations We don't have one act, just like Nosa had mentioned, we don't have one act that says this is how you do it or this is not how you do it. But there are principles, there are sustainability principles, there are ESG principles, considerations that would have to be made when you want to issue those green bonds. Is the way to go. The issue is, are there people who are interested in issuing the green bonds? Yes, there are, but again, there's stringent positions that you have to be in. So you have to be able to comply with certain principles for you to be able to access the funds in that market. Are there people who want to buy into green or structured notes that are green, for lack of a better word, sustainable bonds, where they typically would put it? Yes, there are certain people who, like we talked about, the ESG story. So you're going to have to start reporting on your ESG story. How do you start that? For some entities, they're already in that green position where they're complying with ESG principles. But for some entities, they're in that transition phase. And so they want to start to invest in green bonds, social bonds that would help them to start to build their story. So you see funds, for instance, that are just they're typical, they're just focused on investing on only green bonds, for instance, or only social bonds. So those are the sort of things that you start to find. And increasingly, you would also start to see funds that are, focused on just green financing, because it's going to have, like you said, a longer term impact on the society, and so long-term value, essentially.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. Hopefully you will see more of that in the near future. Now, just, one key aspect of all of this is how we manage our emissions. And one of probably the biggest source of emission is carbon. And from the Kyoto Protocol, we found a way. I mean, it's a capital-intensive world, and we found a way to kind of monetize carbon through carbon offsets, and that is in the form of carbon credits. And so it's becoming a serious conversation these days, especially as a financing option. More, especially in developing countries, we've had project sponsors in developing countries trade carbon credits for finance, especially from developed countries and very large organizations who produce more carbon than necessary. So Dipo, I'm just going to come to you as a project sponsor again. How viable, your line of business, how viable are carbon credits, or how have they been? And what do you think will be the practicalities of trading carbon credits?
Thank you. So the reality is that Nigeria is not a very developed market when it comes to carbon credit trading. As Nosa had mentioned, the Climate Change Act was enacted right after the Committee of Parties meeting in 2021. And the National Council of Climate Change was only established, I think, last year. They haven't really gotten off their feet. Taking the responsibility from the relevant departments in the Ministry of Environment, even then, it wasn't a very developed protocol or set of procedures that we had for carbon trading. Unlike other countries where the cap and trade system, which is the system where emissions are allocated to companies, and companies can trade off the emission reductions to other companies who have not been able to do so, so that they don't reach their emissions caps and incur significant penalties. It doesn't exist in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, I think the only African country that has that system in place is South Africa. And in the whole of Africa, there are only maybe 1 or 2 or 3 emissions trading exchanges or systems. Even in terms of doing the carbon limit allocation, all of that hasn't yet happened in Nigeria. So in reality, the only carbon trading that goes on in Nigeria is on voluntary markets, and for people who are able to access specialty funds and protocols in other countries. For example, the EU fuel cap directive that allows EU companies to come to countries where you can find trading. I think that's fund is actually limited to the upstream industry. So again, the access to those markets for funding is quite limited. And not only is it limited, but the road to get there can be very, very difficult and onerous. For you to establish that you have carbon credits that you can sell, you need to, number one, have a project that meets the criteria. You need to register it. You need to have it evaluated. You need to go through the process of implementation. When you go through the process of implementation, you need to have that implementation evaluated and monitored before you are then certified. And then, for example, for the EU directive system, you can only trade those carbon credits for 1 year, after which you have to retire them, and then you can only gain funding for additional emission savings that you're able to give. Essentially, what that results in is that only a few projects in Nigeria actually have access to carbon credits as a means of financing. And then the second issue is that money comes after your project has been verified and established, which means that you can't use it for development funding. So in reality, just to answer your question in short form, the reality is that while it can be beneficial as a means of extra income to subsidize your project, it's not realistic for it to be the main source of funding for most projects in Nigeria, unless you are getting direct funding from any specialty funds that are interested in encouraging your project by being involved on the development side. I think that once the National Council on Climate Change establishes the carbon pricing system, which will also involve creating those carbon limits so that companies that meet those emissions can actually develop and increase their capture of carbon credits that they can then sell. Then you have a system that can realistically finance projects. And the last point I want to make is that the pricing for carbon credits in reality isn't quite where we need it to be for it to be a viable financing source. On the voluntary market, pricing for carbon credits per metric ton can go from less than $1 to maybe at your highest level, realistically, $5 to $6, $7, unless you're going to those specialty projects like the EU project I mentioned, where you can earn maybe $80 to $100 or euros on your carbon credits. And the reason why that system works and is so sought after is, number one, the monitoring process is very arduous. You don't have any greenwashing there. And number two is that the penalties that EU countries impose on people who fail their carbon limits is maybe 400, 500 euros per ton of CO2. So the incentives are there. I think the incentives build a system. And for us to get to a system where people can rely on carbon credits as a means of financing, you need to build that incentive system first. I understand that very soon we might have a carbon tax. And maybe that is what's going to spur Nigerian companies to really sit up and take this seriously. And then people will have carbon credits that they can buy and sell. And realistically, can use to fund maybe subsequent projects or your operations. But I'm not sure we're at the stage that you can fund your project from the development side. Yes.
Thank you for that. I find it very interesting that you said that the financing, the funds they can't be used for the development stage of the project. And in this side of the world, that is probably how we need it the most.
Yeah. So
from what you said, I think I'll probably just say it's probably just a means for the big boys just to launder their image, you know, when you have, if you can say you have carbon credits, especially from some developing countries where you've invested.
Well, not exactly. I'm sorry to just jump in here, but I think if we look at what the objective isn't necessarily to make money. The objective is to save the environment and make sure that we are building a system that generates wealth and industry without destroying the climate in the process. And so I think that the way regulation is building in every country around the world, and especially in Nigeria, and regardless of whether or not you're earning money from carbon credits, you need to start to comply, because the penalties and downsides, not just to your stakeholders, but to your financial bottom line is very significant. And so I think that, I want to encourage companies to really take ESG seriously and try and incorporate it into their practices going forward, regardless of whatever upsides that you may see in terms of financial benefits, direct financial benefits.
Thank you very much for that.
I
Okay,
mean, to add to what he just said, it's not just, the objective is not to launder image or anything. Because if you are creating a market for anything, you are trying to find a price for it. So whether you go through carbon credits mechanisms or you go through a carbon tax, you are trying to find I won't say find, but you are trying to find a price for it, and then create a market where people that are more efficient, can gain for that efficiency, and people that are less efficient have to pay that price.
Yeah, maybe just sorry, that this is one of the most interesting things that I think is happening at the moment. I think even now, you have a situation here where there's a COP happening, and it's being hosted by a country that the UAE, and there's a company that has been buying up all the forests in Zimbabwe and some parts of Southern Africa. And they're buying up the forests, conserving in the sense of they are conserving forests. Those forests won't, they want to take down the trees and all of that, and they get credits for that. And there's, I read in the FT some days back that, there's the risk of that company doing that, getting carbon credits and selling those carbon credits to an oil and gas producer, for instance, who buys that carbon credits and uses to offset whatever taxes or whatever emissions limits it had on its operation. So in some sense, yes, that could be greenwashing and all that. So there's could possibly be a game, to people trying to game the system, in order to offset their activities or their carbon generating activities. But in the grand scheme of things, just as Dipo and BC have said, the underlying principle is to protect the environment, and in doing that, to make people more conscious of how their activities impact on the environment, and to take whatever mitigation or adaptations measures they can take in order to reduce those emissions in their activities. So yes, that can be done through the carbon tax, where it's introduced, or through when there's a market for trading carbon, so people can make sure that their operations, in order to get carbon credits, reduce their emissions in order to be within limits or below limits that have been set, and get those credits, which they can then generate income from.
So sorry, I'm just gonna follow through with what you said in terms of the buying of the large forest area in African countries mostly, so that you can gain carbon credits. So again, I think sometimes the S in the ESG is lost. So the social aspect of it, which is the impact on the community. So what we find, just like you said, is you have entities in other jurisdictions coming into places where you have green forests, buy up those forests. But again, what you're doing is you're preventing the people in that community from owning the land. And so being able to use those, to generate funds or to grow trees or to do economic activities. So essentially, sometimes it might be lost, but it's something that regulators have to continue to look at in terms of whether you can just go into a different jurisdiction and buy up all the land, and there's also the ownership conversations as well. Just want to shoot that.
okay, thank you. So I think we can all agree that the system it can be gamed and is susceptible to greenwashing. And so before we take comments from other members present, and I see we have some questions from people online. I think I'll just Nosa, I'm just going to ask you the last question. So based on this, it's obvious that with these carbon credits, just in order to protect, because it looks like the benefactors, developed countries will benefit mostly from it than developing countries. So do you think we need, again, just like a body of policies or one law just to, because the thing about Nigeria and other developing countries is that unlike the developed world, where they went through the first industrial revolution, the second, the third, and the fourth, the way technology is that for us, we can jump stages. So do you think we need a law that would wait for us when we get there, that, okay, this is the law that, so by the time we eventually get there, we will not be trying to play catch up?
I'm not sure I really get, but maybe I should.
Do you like me to rephrase?
Yeah, because yeah, I think that.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, my question is that are we any closer to achieving policies for carbon pricing, emission trading, and schemes to help with energy transition generally?
Okay, yeah. I think Nigeria, speaking about Nigeria specifically, I think we are on the right path. I think the first thing is a recognition of ESG principles and the relevance and the need, to adopt those principles. And I think, just as I mentioned earlier, the government has already shown that at COP26, the president had indicated that Nigeria had signed up to that protocol, and had also put Nigeria on the path towards working towards an ambitious target of net zero by 2020, but by 2060 rather. Now, yes, it's ambitious, but at least the recognition. And taking that recognition a step further, there's the enactment of the Climate Change Act. Now, the Climate Change Act is sort of a robust body of work that sets up a body that should then drive this process as the council. Now, in the long run, there's a lot of work to be done. Whether setting up, whether it's a carbon tax, introduction of a carbon tax, setting caps on emissions by companies in the manufacturing sector, in the oil and gas sector, as the case may be. Now, all of that has to be done, and it will take time. And I think there's also recognition of there's a just transition, right? We can't, and I think that's just a recognition that yes, the opportunities that have been created for less developed countries like ourselves in this framework. There's limited access to funding for oil projects, but for gas projects, there's still some drive by the financial institutions to fund gas utilization projects. So it creates an avenue for new players to come into the space, and also for the whole gas, value chain for people to get on that and be a driver for economic development. So in the long run, I would say yes, we are on our way to having laws, having policies and principles that embrace ESG principles, that move us closer to having emissions targets, and moves private, towards regulating private and more public players in terms of meeting those ESG concerns and greenhouse gas emissions targets. When we will get there, may not be at the same pace as the Western world. And I think there needs to be recognition of that. African countries, again, only contribute 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So there needs to be recognition that we are not at the same place as the West. We still need, they are both sides of the coin. If we are going to stop, getting our oil out of the ground and selling our oil, which forms a critical part of funding, of our national funding, then there needs to also be a provision of funding from the West, right, to fund development activities in Africa and other less developed countries that have signed up to meeting greenhouse gas emissions targets.
Thank you very much. So let's quickly look at the questions we have from the audience. So Chichi is asking, could you please expatiate on why you said that gas flaring would become more uneconomic in view of the new rate of penalty? Also, could you please illustrate how the rate of penalty compares to potential revenue accruable from gas production whilst flaring? This will help us to appreciate the potential for difference. Deterrence, sorry. And the second question is, please, do you have a feel for the current level of implementation of the CCA 2021? I presume that's the Climate Change Act. A requirement for private entities with employees numbering 15 and above to designate a climate change officer or an environmental sustainability officer to provide for the annual reports on the entity's efforts at meeting its carbon emission reduction and climate adaptation plan. So I think the first one will be to you, Dipo, and Nosa will take the second.
Okay, let me attempt to answer that question. I'm trying to remember what the gas flaring penalty is. It $2.50? $3.50. I mean, realistically, if you're selling gas in locally, I mean, you'd be lucky to find a buyer to buy at that price. That's the first point. The second point is that it's not really just about the fact that they're giving penalties that actually hurt your pocket. It's that the regulators have a zero tolerance policy to gas flaring. It's a national policy, and as what that means is that if you flagrantly disregard this requirement, you run the risk of losing your license. You're also exposed to environmental things by your host community. And so the current environment doesn't accommodate flagrant flaring. You only flare in very, very extreme situations for operational reasons. And even then, you have to account to the NUPRC for every single million scope of gas that you flare. So this is not an environment back 10, 20 years ago where the government turned a blind eye because it was trying to improve crude revenue. The government has a zero tolerance policy to gas flaring these days.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think if you don't have a gas utilization plan in the FDP that you submit to the NPRC, it won't be approved.
Yeah.
Right. So if you don't have a plan on how you're going to utilize gas, for whatever development you want to do on your assets, then you won't get that approved and you can't move ahead. So it's sort of it won't take one step forward from just a gas flaring penalty, to not getting an approval, which forces you to actually have a gas utilization project and put it in place. And as we said before, even for when you want to finance, you won't be able to get financing, debt financing nowadays without actually showing a gas utilization project and that you're not flaring gas. So I think it's there are a number of these approaches that have been taken that sort of requires you to take a step back and actually do an evaluation of how much it could be hurt by proceeding with gas flaring activities, as opposed to either doing a gas utilization project yourself or getting a third party to do that project for you. And because whether it's a gas processing plant or not, and then you told your gas, through that, so there are various gas monetization projects that can be adopted that helps you to avoid whatever penalties from the regulators as well as failure of your equipment. So I don't on the second question, I don't know if I'm in I'm the best place to answer that. I think someone with operations who that requirement to be more pertinent to will be in the better place. But I can try and then maybe those who have operations. Sorry? The second question.
I think
on the requirements to have a climate change officer and organization with employees above 50.
Yeah.
And because I think it's more what Chichi is looking for, it's more practical. What has been done practically by organizations that are allowed to comply with that.
So I mean, I think that what the Act what the act provided is that there's going to be an action plan that would be published. Yeah. So we would all know what that action plan is. I haven't seen that, and it was meant to come out 12 months after the act was enacted. I'm not aware that that action plan is in place. And if the action plan is not in place, then I wonder whether companies have started to apply any of the provisions as of today. But I mean, it's something that we can look into.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Nosa. Thank you, Dipo. Thank you, Lucy. Just before we round up, I'd like to ask from the general audience present if you have any comments or questions before we round up. Okay.
Thank you to the presenters. I just have this question. Since there's no regulation or like one law or regulation that cuts across all the different companies, then how can financial institutions, for instance, confirm compliance by a company? So for all other companies, it's easier. They have a compliance certificate from DPR. So when a company that doesn't have any formal regulatory body seeking credit facilities, how do we confirm that it comply the ESG policies and requirements and regulations? I recently an example, and I've relied on an internal checklist done by an RM. But so I just want to know what is if there's any standard or we need to know that the company has complied.
So I mean, I think there's no, like I said, there's no specific body of laws that have been codified in Nigeria, but they are the standards, the general standards. So just like you got something from somewhere, they probably got it from the standards. So there's the Equator Principles, for instance, the other sustainability standards. And so what that does is it helps you to think about what you need to consider as a bank in terms of providing credits for different sectors. So one sector is different from the other sector in terms of where are you putting up the projects, for instance, where are you doing your business? What kind of business are you doing? How does it impact on the society? How does it impact on the community? Do you have your corporate governance in place? So all of these are the things that banks will want to see going forward in terms of whether they're going to be providing you with credit or not. So I don't think that we need to wait for the laws, the body of law, right, codified. I think that we can look at those principles, just the general principles surrounding ESG as a whole.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, so in the absence of any more questions, I think we'll bring the session to a close now. Thank you very much for everyone present and those joining online. We're grateful for giving us your time and attention. And I hope that we'll be able to get one or two things from the discussions we've had today. Thank you. Thank you again.